Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So I want to talk about this town hall meeting that Bernie Sanders had. During this meeting on CNN, a black woman asked him what is his position on reparations. And in response to that question, Bernie Sanders basically danced around the issue, avoided the issue, and tried to answer it in an indirect way. At some point, the CNN host had to actually redirect him and asked him again what is if he supports reparations. So when he was asked this, he talked about how he wanted to end institutionalized racism in this country. He went on to talk about childhood poverty in the black community, talking about how it's like 30% in the black community. He talked about how African Americans die at a higher rate from cancer. He talked about how there are massive levels of disparities when it comes to African Americans compared to white people. And he talked about how we need to do everything that we can to address those disparities. But he did not answer the question of whether or not he supports reparations. So after that, the host basically said, well, do you support reparations or not? Basically, that's what the host was asking him. Do you support reparations or not? And then Bernie Sanders said, well, it depends on what the definition of reparations is. He said he wasn't clear on what reparations actually is. And then the host, Wolf Blitzer, reminded him that you had these two other candidates, Elizabeth Warren and one of the Castro brothers, and they support reparations. And then he went on to cite Elizabeth Warren, talking about how Elizabeth Warren said that systematic and structural change needs to take place in order to address the problem of racism in this country and, the legacy of slavery. That's her position when it comes to reparations. She supports reparations. And then Bernie Sanders basically said, well, I agree with her. Eventually that's what he said. And then, the host reminded Bernie Sanders of statements that he made about reparations in the 2016 election. He basically reminded Bernie Sanders that he described reparations as divisive, and he wanted to know whether or not Bernie Sanders still takes that position. And Bernie Sanders went on to say, well, it depends, on the definition of reparations. So that was his response, and I just want to address this briefly. There are a couple of things. Also, there's another thing that he said, in response to this question. He brought up this legislation that Congressman Clyburn has supported, and that's the 10, 20, 30 legislation, which is focused on addressing the problem of poverty. He cited that, as something that he supports as a way to, deflect from this question about reparations. And so I want to just address some of these things. I want to address, Bernie Sanders in particular and just the Democratic Party, period, when it comes to this issue of reparations. First of all, that legislation that Clyburn is supporting has nothing to do with reparations. That is legislation that deals with poverty, specific examples of poverty. That doesn't address the legacy of slavery. That is not reparations for black people being enslaved in this country for hundreds of years without compensation. That doesn't address that at all. It addresses poverty, which can affect, people of different races. It's not limited to the African American community. So that's one thing. The other thing is this. Bernie Sanders' response was very ambiguous. His response about the need to address structural and institutional racism in this country. Obviously anybody would co-sign that, like they would support that. Like even a right-wing Republican would say, well, I support addressing those things. But it's when you get into the details, that's what really matters. That's how what his real plans are. And I think that he needs to articulate what those plans are in a succinct kind of way, in a concise kind of way. Summarize like how he plans to address these structural and institutional problems of racism in this country. He needs to elaborate on that. That is no substitute for addressing this question of reparations. I think that that's part of it. And that's going to bring me to another point. Like, I'll talk about, civil rights legislation versus reparations in a minute. But yeah, I mean, I just find it very disappointing that you have a progressive like Bernie Sanders, like unwilling to like directly address this question, unwilling to just say yes or no as to whether or not he supports reparations. And the fact during the last election that he characterized reparations as divisive is deeply problematic, man. I mean, it's problematic because when these other groups seek compensation for wrong that has been done to them, nobody says that they're being divisive. You know, nobody criticizes them and attacks them. You know, whether we're talking about what happened with the Jews and how they were compensated because of what Nazi Germany did, and even the United States compensated the Jews in some kind of way. Nobody said that was divisive. But when it comes to the African American, when we demand compensation for hundreds of years of free labor, you know, hundreds of years of oppression and brutality against us, all of a sudden we're divisive. When we're calling for compensation for all those ancestors that are buried at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, all of a sudden we're divisive. When we call for compensation for the people that were beaten and raped and, you know, stripped of everything, stripped of their humanity and reduced to property, all of a sudden we're the ones that are divisive. And I think that that's deeply problematic for someone to even fix their lips to say that the call for justice is divisive, especially someone who was a part of the civil rights movement. That's deeply disappointing, you know, and it's very troubling. This issue of reparation has to be addressed. You know, we need to confront all of these politicians. Ask every single politician that's running for office, what is your position on reparations? I don't care if they're Democrat or Republican. Both parties need to be asked this question. What is your position on reparations? They need to be asked that. And let me be perfectly clear. Someone left a comment to my last video dealing with Kamala Harris and reparations. And they basically said, well, you know, I'm not a one-issue voter. Like if somebody else has, you know, a progressive agenda and, you know, they just don't happen to support reparations and they're going against like a candidate that's far worse for our community, then I'm going to vote for that person. And I agree with that. Like, I'm not saying that reparations is the sole issue by which I elect to, you know, vote for a candidate. I'm not saying that at all. But I think that we need to push as many issues that are important to us as possible. And reparations is one of those issues. Reparations is a key issue that we need to ask every single politician about. And now I think that it was a good thing that he eventually said that he supports Elizabeth Warren's position. But we need more than that. We need a commitment to reparations. You know, at bare minimum, these people, these politicians, every single one of them needs to support H.R. 40. And that's something, again, that I said before that former Congressman John Conyers put forth to Congress year after year after year, and it made no traction. We need to demand that these politicians take action on H.R. 40. Even if they're not elected president, they're still members of the Senate. You know, Kamala Harris is a senator. Bernie Sanders is a senator. And it's my understanding that with H.R. 40, he needed sponsor from one senator or something like that to move it forward. And not one of these senators supported this thing. Not one of them. So we need to ask them, what is your position on that? If you can't support a basic study on the question of reparations, you don't deserve our support. All these companies got rich off of our suffering, man. All these banks got rich off of our suffering. The federal government got rich off our suffering. You know, these insurance companies got rich off of our suffering. These major corporations got rich off of our suffering. You know, wealthy white families got rich off of our suffering. And they need to compensate the descendants of slaves. They need to. And to call for such compensation is to call for justice. You can't address these fundamental problems in our community without going to the heart of the matter, and that's reparations, repairing the damage that was done as a result of hundreds of years of slavery and as a result of decades of Jim Crow. You can't address these disparities without dealing with reparations. And that brings me to this whole point about civil rights legislation. Like, people will suggest that because we have civil rights legislation, that somehow that is reparations. That is not reparations. That is something that goes forward in the future in terms of ending discriminatory practices going forward. But it doesn't address the massive disparities that was caused as a result of black people being held back for hundreds of years, being held in bondage for hundreds of years. Held all that time. And because all of a sudden you lift certain restrictions and stuff like that, we're supposed to be equal now, despite the fact that the black people were held back for hundreds of years. That's not reparations. That is something positive. Obviously, I support all this civil rights legislation that has been passed. It helps future generations, but it doesn't address the massive disparities. That's the reason why, despite all this civil rights legislation that we still have massive wealth inequality between black people and white people. Massive differences. Even with black people that had the same level of education as some of these white people. We're still behind the 8 ball, basically. We're still far behind. And that's because of this legacy of slavery. This legacy of Jim Crow being locked out of economic opportunity for hundreds of years. Being locked out of economic opportunity because of redlining and all those things. It's like they took the shackles off and all that kind of stuff, and they said, now you're free. It's like we're in a race with other groups of people, and these other people have been given hundreds of years a head start. And all of a sudden, because they unleashed the shackles, we're supposed to be able to win that race or catch up with them or to be competitive, even though we've been held back hundreds of years? No, reparations is the way that you address that. Not just some civil rights legislation that goes forward. You don't address it with just some programs designed to deal with just poverty. This problem of racism affects all black people regardless of their income. You got stories of, black people that have all this affluence and, wealth and all that stuff, and they're still treated like second-class citizens. You got black people with all this education and all this experience still earning less than their white counterparts, still having far less wealth than their white counterparts. This problem is not just some class problem, and that's something that Bernie Sanders does not understand. That's something he doesn't understand. So there's a couple of points that I want to make before, I conclude. I got to get to work. So going back to this point about this general legislation, like people propose these legislation, different laws and stuff like that have general application that affect all different types of people. That's not reparations, man. And we're not going for the okie doke. Telling us about some 2020, 10, 20, 30 legislation. That's not reparations. Kamala Harris telling us about the LIFT Act. That's not reparations. We're not going for the okie doke. What is your position on HR 40? Our problem is a particularized problem that needs particularized solutions. A particular problem that deserves particular solutions that address us specifically. You can't address a problem that was limited to African Americans by, having some broad-based solution that's just going to, that's going to affect any and everybody. When the problem was targeted towards black people, it was Africans enslaved in this country. That's who was enslaved. Not everybody, not just poor people as a group. It was African Americans particularly, the Africans enslaved in America. That's who was targeted. So, so I had to address that point. The other thing that I have to address is just the Democratic Party, period, in this question of reparations. The Democratic Party would be practically non-existent and irrelevant if it wasn't for black people. They can't win a national election without the black vote. They can't win even a statewide election without the black vote. But yet when it comes to reparations, they haven't found it fit to put that on their agenda. That needs to be a part of the Democratic Party platform. And black people need to demand that it be incorporated into the party platform. That's what we need to do. All this support we give to the Democrats, Black people support the Democratic Party over 90% in many cases. And the Democratic Party can't support reparations? You got black people in all these influential positions in the Democratic Party, and you can't tell me, and you're trying to tell me that we can't get reparations on the party platform. That should be a priority for any black Democrat. Any black Democrat that has ancestors who were enslaved in this country, that should be a part of the Democratic platform, and you should demand that it be incorporated in the Democratic Party platform. We should demand this because we know that we are essential to the Democrats. We're the most loyal to the Democratic Party. And in exchange for that loyalty, they need to be loyal to us. They need to be loyal to the issue of reparations. It doesn't make sense that you had that brother, John Conyers, constantly putting that H.R. 40 before Congress and making no traction at all. Well before this ADOS stuff, you had John Conyers pushing for reparations. Way before that. And you had all these other groups pushing for reparations well before this modern day, fly-by-night ADOS movement. But these members of Congress didn't act on it. The Democratic Party didn't act on it. And it's time that we demand more from these parties, man, from both parties, from all these candidates, but in particular the Democratic Party. They need to incorporate that into their party platform. Now, yesterday I put something on my personal Facebook page to the same effect, basically saying that the Democratic Party needs to add reparations to their party platform. And I had one person in particular, a couple of people rather, basically suggested reparations is a dream and that we're wasting our time talking about reparations. It's something that's never going to happen and all that. And my response to those people is this, man. Everything that becomes material starts out as an idea. It starts out as a dream. And then it eventually becomes manifest as a material part of reality. We have to be the ones to make it happen. Just like, the thought of a black president was thought to be a joke, was thought to be some kind of dream or some kind of fantasy until it became a reality. The thought that slavery would end in this country was thought to be some kind of dream or some kind of fantasy until it actually became a reality. The thought of ending Jim Crow was thought to be some kind of dream or something that would never become real until it became a reality, until we saw the end of Jim Crow. The thought of man flying seemed to be some kind of dream or fantasy, I'm sure. Something like somebody said, that's ridiculous. Man will never be able to fly, until man created the plane and flew into the air. People probably thought that it would be impossible to go to the moon until man actually created the means to go to the moon. We have the power to make reparations a reality. But too many of us have bought into this defeatist mentality. Too many of us have basically surrendered, basically have bowed down and said that we can't make it happen. We can make it happen. We can make it happen by enforcing our will and demanding that these politicians bring this to the forefront. At the very minimum, again, we need to be pushing for H.R. 40. We need to. Now, the last thing that I want to address before I go is this. So the last thing I want to address is this ADOS movement. I did like 3 videos to these people, and I noticed that they continue to comment on those videos, and they also comment on other videos bringing up this ADOS stuff. Basically a lot of these people are trolling my channel about this ADOS stuff. And I just want to be perfectly clear, man. As I've indicated in this particular video and many other videos before this videos, I support reparations 100%. There's nothing new about the call for reparations. People have been calling for reparations well before Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore came up with this whole ADOS thing. So miss me with that. Like, I mean, if your whole point is reparations, stop wasting your time arguing with me, because I support reparations for African Americans in this country. I support reparations for so-called descendants of slaves. So miss me with those comments about how I'm missing the point about ADOS. Miss me with that. And half of these people that say this stuff haven't even watched Antonio Moore's video where he actually explains what ADOS is. Because if they watched that video, they would understand what I was saying. They would understand my critique of their position. That's the one thing that needs to be pointed out. Another thing is this. Again, I support reparations, but I do not support tribalism. I do not support xenophobia. I do not support divisiveness. I do not support bigotry against our black brothers and sisters who are immigrants. I don't support that. I don't co-sign, this mega mentality that Yvette Carnell and that guy Antonio Moore have. I don't co-sign that. I reject that. I don't ride with that. I oppose that with everything in me. Tribalism is backwardness. We need to be thinking about nationhood instead of tribalism. We need to think about unity instead of division. And I think that that's the biggest problem with this ADOS movement, to summarize it. Again, when it comes to reparations, I can ride with them on that. We can rally together on that issue. But when it comes to this anti-immigrant sentiment, this anti-Pan-Africanist sentiment, I can't ride with that. And I will oppose it every time. And I don't care who likes it or who doesn't like it. The other thing is this. I'm an African first. These ADOS people, they put their American identity first. They put they don't even call themselves African descendants of slaves. They call themselves American descendants of slaves. They identify with America more than they identify with the motherland. And I think that that's problematic. America is the land of the slave. This is the land where they enslaved us. This is the land where our captors held us against our will. And you want to identify with that more than you want to identify with your motherland, where you came from, the cradle of human civilization. That, to me, that reflects a Negro mentality. But these are the black militants of today. But anyway, I could go on. And I want to let you all know that I plan to write a thorough response to this ADOS movement on my written blog. Just breaking down a lot of the points that they make and actually quoting the things. I want to watch, Yvette Carnell's anti-Pan-Africanist video and just deconstruct it. So y'all can look forward to that. Again, don't come here, bringing up this ADOS thing as if I don't support reparations. I support reparations. How many times must I say this? I don't have any problems with African Americans having a black agenda. So don't come here saying that I have a problem with that when I've been talking about the need for a black agenda for years before this ADOS nonsense. Back to work. So I'm going to have to go. So with that, I'm going to say peace and blessings to each and every one of you. Please rate, comment, and subscribe. Peace.